Hello to all of you. I'm Rebecca Sweeney, and I serve as Senior Director for Programs and Policy for the Wisconsin Cheesemakers Association. And I just want to start today by thanking all of you for taking the time to join us for this presentation. It's the first in our series of monthly members-only webinars as we endeavor to provide you with more information to build your business, to support your workforce, and to increase the quality and safety of dairy products made here in the United States. So we welcome your ideas on other topics, but today we are proud to bring you a presentation focused on cybersecurity threats and also strategies to safeguard your business online. A little housekeeping before we get started, kind of commonplace for these webinars. First, I'd like to ask you again to be sure that you're muted so that we can avoid any interruptions during today's presentation. And if you have any questions during today's program, please feel free to add them to our chat stream through your Zoom control panel. You can send them to me and I will present them anonymously, or you can share them with the entire group. That's completely up to you. We're going to start though, just to make sure everybody knows what we're doing today. Here's a look at our agenda. We'll begin with a look at the increasing prevalence of cyber attacks, specifically focusing on ransomware and fraud, which are some of the more common attacks that you might face. And then we'll transition into practical strategies that you can take, strategies you can employ to safeguard your online activity, and also some options so that you might transfer your cyber risk. We're going to be sure to reserve some time for questions and answers at the end of today's program. Like I mentioned, please put those in the chat. Our presenters today have very generously agreed to field as many as possible within our hour-long time frame. We're going to begin today with some information from DOJ on the prevalence of cyber attacks. And it's my pleasure to introduce Mike Hemberger from the Department of Justice. He is serving in an on-call, around-the-clock position. I know because I get his emails late at night. I get them on the weekends. He is here to meet your needs and to alert you when there has been a cyber attack. And we're so grateful for his dedicated service. And we're also grateful today that he's taking some time out of his schedule to share some expertise and insight so that we might prevent some of those attacks in the future. Prevention is always our preferred method, right, Mike?
Absolutely. That's a big chunk of why we're here. So thank you, Rebecca. Really appreciate it. And I'll get the screen shared here. And hopefully you're seeing the presentation. All right, thanks. As Rebecca said, I'm Mike Hemberger. I'm with the Wisconsin Department of Justice. I'm assigned to the Wisconsin Statewide Intelligence Center. We're the fusion center for the state. Work a variety of problem sets from mass casualty attack, counterterrorism type things, human trafficking to cyber and financial crimes. And that's where I come into play, part of the cyber and financial crime unit for the fusion center. Going to just kind of briefly run through, this is really a threat brief we've given several times recently. You know, the core content is weirdly tailored to this audience, even though it is the same briefing we give state agencies and others, because we're going to talk about the threats we're seeing a lot of right now, ransomware and fraud being the big two. And then talk a little bit about what you can do to defend yourself, your business, and then turn it back over. In the threats portion, going to talk about email, generally speaking, because on any given day, when we're in front of a computer, email is probably the most dangerous thing we're doing, to be candid. And so we'll talk a little bit about that in particular, go through ransomware and the rise of extortion as a tactic around ransomware and explain what that means. And then talk about what we've seen with fraud as the pandemic has been ongoing. So one of my favorite slides to present, the Captain Obvious slide, because it's true. You know, why are there so many email-based attacks? Because they work. The reality is, you know, for years, decades really, the IT community has said, look, you know, there is no silver bullet out there for computer security, for network security, for securing your business. There's no one product you can buy or service you can pay for that's going to take care of all your problems. So this defense in depth concept was really, applied to cybersecurity. You need a firewall, and you need, antivirus or endpoint protection, and you need. And the reality is that, once an attacker is able to get legitimate credentials from an employee and look like that employee to all of those, network appliances, those tools, once they look like a legitimate employee, it's essentially game over. That is the end state they're looking for, is to be as close as they can to appearing to be a legitimate employee, so their traffic blends in, so everything appears normal. And so that's why we have so many of these email-based attacks, that they can bypass or minimize their exposure to a lot of these security layers and end up in an inbox. And it's not an easy problem to solve, as many of you, I am sure, are aware. But this isn't a new concept either. You could see from the small arrow on the slide there, this was a slide that was presented, by others as part of work that was done in 2015. So, attackers trying to get to the inbox is not new behavior, but it continues to be the primary route we see. As far as ransomware and extortion, take the Wayback Machine, even 3 or 4 years ago. So not very long ago, but, several years ago, this was primarily a problem for home users. Small number of attackers, the tool sets weren't particularly good. The ransomware was, written by an attacker without a lot of skill. And so, you would get the home users would have their systems encrypted. They'd negotiate with the attacker, $300-400 later, they could decrypt their machine, or they could wait a month or so and somebody would release a tool, because the ransomware was not professionally written. Somebody would release a tool that, they could use to unlock their network. Well, even those 3 or 4 years ago is, a lifetime in cybersecurity, and that landscape has dramatically changed. With the attacks I'll talk about that have been reported, to the state, we've had one home user out of the 79 off the top of my head that you'll see that we'll talk about coming up here. Home users just aren't the target anymore. It's a combination of factors that drove that, but as more folks are using iOS devices, their iPhones, iPads, and using iCloud for backup storage, all of a sudden those, important documents and, photos of the child's first steps and those, kind of important things to each and every one of us are now stored on the cloud where the ransomware isn't impacting. So the attackers were finding they're having a hard time making money doing this. They're having to support a variety of users, a variety of environments. Do you really want to talk grandma through buying Bitcoin and decrypting the computer as an attacker? No, you don't want to do that. So they really did shift over to the business model we see today. A variety of professional gangs using independent contractors, very, very industry standard toolkits. They can afford the best and pay for the best. And they focus on business and governments. The vast majority of what we see is focused on business as far as ransomware. Governments are hit, but they're more of a byproduct in the reporting we see. The professionalization and the independent contractors piece is what really makes it challenging for defenders to defend against this. You're not defending against a half a dozen Russians who are part of a known group who use this one particular set of tools to get in. You're dealing with thousands of actors from all over the world, primarily Eastern Europe, but not exclusively. So it has really complicated the defender's mission in all this. You're the folks that are protecting your networks. What we're also seeing for the top tier ransomware organizations, the pressure tactics, the extortion has been ramped up. Hack and leak is now the expectation. They're not just going to, essentially deny you your systems and your data, stop you from using your equipment. They're going to also take all of the information they can and potentially publicly expose it, or at the very least threaten to publicly expose it. So your contracts, your vendors, your pricing information, all that, kind of proprietary sensitive information that you don't want everybody and their brother to have, they're going to threaten to expose. And that's part of the reason we see, the effect on the industry is a lot of times, hey, we need to pay to keep this quiet. We need to pay to keep this data from going out. Well, bad news is your data is already outside of your control. The attackers have it. It's just how far outside of your control it gets at that point. We've also seen calls to the C-suite, the CEO, the CIO, et cetera, calls to customers or primary vendors to try to ramp the pressure up for you to pay. That has become an increasingly common tactic. How do they know that kind of information? It's part of that data they're stealing, as is insurance policies, what those policy limits are, your financial statements. They're looking to use any tool they can to help them set a ransom price that you will pay. That's as high as they can get out of you while you will still pay it. And again, to maximize the pressure on you. They know that org chart. They'll call the CEO, they'll call the CISO and apply that pressure. Infection vectors, variety of sources. Vulnerabilities is a common one. That unpatched system that's sitting on the network that, you just forgot about, or, the vulnerability came out 2 weeks ago and you haven't had time yet to take the systems down for maintenance and patch them. We're seeing a window now of about 24 to 48 hours from when a patch drops to when the vulnerability has been reversed by malicious actors and starts being used against all of us. So that window we used to have of, hey, something, software just dropped, I need to update my systems. Yeah, I'll get around to it next week. That window is now not uncommon to be about 24, 48 hours before we see attackers going after those vulnerabilities. After they've been disclosed by the companies, patch goes out the door. There's a small grace period there where the malicious actors are working to develop code to attack that vulnerability, and it doesn't take them long anymore. Phishing, really common. We talked about it already. I'll talk about it a little bit more in a slide coming up. Malicious software, particularly malicious spam. These are the emails that arrive in the inbox with what appears to be a Word document, an Excel spreadsheet. Click on this, enable macros to continue for your security, and it's running malicious code behind the scenes, reaching out, grabbing whatever additional payloads they want to run. So typically what we'll see is, that attachment gets clicked by a user, that box becomes infected, they start moving across the network, they start stealing documents, Excel spreadsheets, whatever else they want to steal. And then the final stage will be ransomware. That can be anywhere from realistically several hours to, a week, depending on how thorough and skilled the actor is. And the other thing we see is an exploit of third parties. One of the things we talk about as a defense is patch your systems. Every piece of software, everything with a network connection, make sure it's up to date. If it's not supported by the vendor anymore, replace it. One of the things we see is, there are third parties that will provide that as a service to you. Hey, we'll automate your updates so they're happening as quickly as possible. And that's a fantastic thing, right up until that company becomes the target of ransomware and their update channel, for your machines is used to spread the ransomware, which has been seen both in Wisconsin and nationally. So that third party risk is always something to consider as well. When we look at reporting across Wisconsin, you'll see this is reporting drawn from the FBI's Internet Crime Complaint Center. We have back-end access. We work with the Cyber Squad out of Milwaukee, so we can look at all the reports and work with victims and try to assist where we can. And I don't think you need to be a statistician to see what the trend line would look like on that, increasing frequency of attacks. And what we've really seen is 2020 was already a very bad year for ransomware. There was already a lot of Wisconsin companies being hit. And really in 2021, that just exploded, peaking in July with an automated ransomware event. And again, talked about that third-party risk. In that case, it was the ransomware group Ryuk that managed to get into Kaseya. Kaseya is a patch management system, among others. So a lot of folks use that to make sure their systems are up to date. What we saw right around the 4th of July holiday was a large portion of those 10 events were due to Ryuk and Kaseya. Pressure grew nationally after we saw the ransomware against one of the leading beef providers to the United States and others. That attention and pressure kind of backed those groups off for a brief period. But September, you see through the end of the month, we had 8 events. Really, these are the reported events. And so when you look at that map and say, haha, I'm not in a county that's blue, these are the events that are reported to the FBI, which is a small subset of the total number of attacks. We know that because the hackers are leaking the documents on their site, and we can look and see who the victims are, whether they're reporting that to law enforcement or not. So the unfortunate reality is, most of our state is probably blue. They go where the opportunity is. They go where the unprotected systems are. They go where they know they're going to be able to apply pressure. Manufacturing industries, which can't sustain, long periods of downtime. The legal profession, they love targeting attorneys because they know the pressures there. That attorney-client confidentiality applies a lot of pressures to the attorneys not to let that kind of information leak out. And so they do. It's a combination of, hey, you've got a system that's open, you're a target of opportunity, or you're in an industry that can't really take downtime, and they know that, and so we'll target those kind of industries. So as the bottom line says there, just about 91% of the ransomware we've seen over the past 2 years or year and a half or so have impacted Wisconsin businesses. Small number of governments, small number of nonprofits, that kind of thing. But really, it's Wisconsin businesses that are bearing the brunt of this. And what we also saw during the pandemic is fraud just exploded. You may have been a lucky recipient of one of the text messages pictured on the right saying, hey, you need to update your unemployment information. The fraud actors have realized there is a large amount of money out there in government channels and others. So we've seen the Wisconsin Department of Workforce Development unemployment fraud just explode. And every week we're playing whack-a-mole with new infrastructure that the malicious actors are standing up. Really, we say at this point, if a system handles financial transactions or data, it's under sustained attack. And typically that can be something as simple as just repeatedly trying to guess a username password combination that's going to get them into your network. That kind of sustained effort is really common. We see it with the Wisconsin child support system. And if you're a malicious actor, is the child support system going to be the place you think, I need to go after that because there's an abundance of money there that I can target? No, it's a target of opportunity because they know it handles financial information or payment information that they can steal and provide identities. So unfortunately, as the bottom bullet says, really getting somebody's personal information is not the hurdle anymore. It's dollars or pennies, depending on what kind of bulk you're buying them in. It's convincing you that, or your financial institution, it's convincing you to carry out the transaction. Great example from Monday. I'll just throw this out there. This is one that came into our inbox Monday. Extraordinarily common. Payroll fraud. Please change my bank account information over to whatever the malicious actor controlled inbox is. This is a really poor quality one. We see This is kind of the bottom tier, really easy to spot. I expect you all can find 10 problems with this email. It still happens. And again, they're looking to just get that person who's in a hurry, person who's distracted, business that doesn't have a process in place to manage those kind of changes. If we look at it quickly, you shouldn't probably be expecting an email from a Czechoslovakian search engine related site. That's essentially Czechoslovakia's Gmail. The bank routing number is green.bank. Large amount of fraud, especially wire fraud going through there. And you see Fed ACH payments. Sue McKinney is a government official, but she is a government official for the state of Indiana, not Wisconsin. And if you even just take a look at the phone number, Wisconsin Manufacturer and Commerce are not, state of Wisconsin. Company headquarters should also stand out. What we see, though, is much more sustained and challenging things to look for. This is an example that came out of one of our community colleges. Community college in Wisconsin, their payroll department said, hey, we just got this weird email. It's the president of the company introducing himself, which is odd because we know the president of the company. He shouldn't be introducing himself. And as they looked, they caught that the email address was one letter off from what they expected to see. Great catch. So they didn't have a loss. No money went out the door. Called us up and said, hey, here's what we're dealing with. Well, when we looked into it, there were 67 other domains registered by the same actor. So you see, the Wisconsin business, 3dconsultingllc.com, and the malicious domain 3dconsultllc.com. That's going to be hard for any of us to catch, any of us. When I was putting this presentation together, I was looking at one of the lines, DEC contracting. I had to really look carefully to see where the difference is. So anything you see in your business that is, hey, we just had this last minute change, we need to change an account. Vendor, employee, I don't care what it is, please verify that. This is one of the ones we see time and again, tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of dollars in losses, especially if you're doing construction. Construction firms, as you can see from this partial list, are really a target because construction projects are big and there's a lot of money there. Same for real estate transactions, you name it. It's extraordinarily common for a malicious actor to swoop in the middle of a transaction. Email address is almost exactly the same, one letter off somewhere. And hey, our payment information has changed. And the important part is process-wise, that should always trigger a stop, think, let's call them. Let's not call the number that's in the email because it's going to be a couple digits twisted around so you don't get the right number, but it looks close. But look them up, find them, call and verify that change. That alone would save Wisconsin businesses collectively hundreds of thousands or millions of dollars a year. I'm going to go through the defenses pretty quickly because I know I'm running on my time here. Basic cyber hygiene, it gets beaten up all the time and we're going to beat it up again because it's absolutely true. Having backups, so if your data is encrypted, you can still get access to it, is a big thing. Multi-factor authentication, having that code sent to a device, having that key you stick in, that USB key that you stick into the computer to validate that it is you, is important. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in a second, but a username and password just isn't good enough anymore. Multi-factor can be beat. It is not a silver bullet, but again, let's make the bad guys work harder. Raising the defense level makes them all work harder, and it starts to weed out those, easier attackers and gets rid of that noise. We always love talking to folks. Your help desk or your IT staff or your contractor, if you've got one, they love helping out. That's what they're there to do. So if you're not sure on something, call. We do it all the time internally whenever we're dealing with something that's, hey, I'm not 100% sure. We'll run it by 2 or 3 extra sets of eyes to take a look at it because we're humans. We make mistakes. We are fallible. So the important thing is, don't hesitate to ask for help. And I talked about it already, but updates, everything that connects to a network, wireless or wired, I don't care, as quickly as you can, automated to the maximum extent possible. Password managers, I'm going to just touch on this briefly. I'm a big believer in password managers. If you look at the table on the right, I've blanked out the usernames to not shame. This was a public leak that came from a Wisconsin company. Those were the passwords in use on their virtual private network, their device that let users dial in from home securely. You don't have to be, a criminal mastermind to realize the capital letter is going to be at the beginning. The numbers are going to be at the end. Fall 2020 # is going to be winter 2020 # in a couple months here. The attackers know this too. And so we as human beings are terrible at picking good passwords. Password managers mean you don't have to remember a username. You don't have to remember a password for the hundreds of different things you need to access. You need to remember one for the password manager and let it generate and fill in all of the other information for you. There's a variety of paid, free tools out there. They're fantastic. Which one you pick doesn't matter to me. They're all good. They all do essentially the same thing. And they're all better than we are at making different passwords that you don't have to remember. Because what we see time and again is that that password that was leaked at a shopping site you visit in your personal life, that same password is the one you use to get into the corporate network. And we see that password reused time and time and time again. So talked a little bit about threats, a little bit about defenses. Our contact information is there. Rebecca has my direct contact information. I welcome any of you to reach out. As Rebecca said, we're 24/7. That is the nature of what we do. So we never mind that call in the evening, on the weekend. Hey, we're running into this weird thing. We need help. That's what we're here to do. So I'll turn it back over to you, Rebecca.
And the sooner you act on those things, the better you are. Time is of the essence in reporting these things and asking for that help. So,
especially with the financial piece,
right.
Back of your head, 72 hours from the loss. There's a lot of things that can be done inside of 72 hours from the loss, including stopping payments going overseas. Once you get past about that 72 hours, it becomes exponentially more difficult to try to claw any of that back. So yes, time is of the essence. Thank you.
I really want to stress that if you get nothing else from Mike's presentation, it's that you need to be paying attention to these things and looking carefully at your emails, and B, if you think you have been attacked, call immediately, get help right away. Mike, thank you so much for sharing your time with us. Appreciate you sticking around with us for questions and answers at the end of the session. As you all know, law enforcement agencies are tasked with bringing cyber criminals to justice, but the fight to prevent attacks and also to protect businesses, they're not alone in that. They have lots of fantastic partners in private industry, maybe none better than our friends over at M3 Insurance, who always answer the call to provide their expertise and insights with industry. And I'm really pleased today to introduce, I would say, one new friend and one old friend, somebody that we know very well. Director of Cyber Liability, Emily Selk, is with us to present today. And we're pleased to welcome back Jen Pino-Gallagher, who runs the food and agribusiness practice at M3 as well. I want to thank you again for both generously sharing your time with us, and I'll send it over to Jen to start.
Thank you so much, Rebecca. And thank you everyone for attending today's webinar. I think it's fair to say that cyber intrusions have been in the news a lot lately, as you heard from Mike, and even more so when it relates to the food and agribusiness sector. You might recall back in March when Molson Coors had a cybersecurity incident that led to major disruption in their operations. And of course, in June with JBS getting hobbled by a ransomware attack. On September 1st of this year, The FBI issued a private industry notification specifically for the food and agricultural sector. And if you haven't seen this notification yet, I know Rebecca has a link to a copy of it in her files, which I'm sure she can send out. The FBI specifically called out the food and ag sector regarding their risk of ransomware attacks, and less than 1 month after they issued their notice, 2 very prominent agricultural co-ops, one in Iowa, one in Minnesota, were hobbled by ransomware just weeks before the fall harvest started, which is probably the worst time of the year for an ag co-op to get hit. But our role today isn't to scare you. As Rebecca mentioned, it's really about sharing information to help your businesses succeed. And that's what we're hoping to do today. Talk about information of ways you can prevent some attacks, kind of dovetail with what Mike already shared, but then also some tools that you can rely on should the worst case scenario happen. And I don't need to really remind the dairy industry about the importance of cybersecurity. If you have a third-party food safety audit, you most likely have included some form of a cybersecurity plan within your yearly audit materials. In fact, if you're SQF certified, you're required to have a crisis management plan in place based on the understanding of known potential risks. If you read their SQF document, you won't see cybersecurity actually called out. You'll see tornado and flood and fire. But as one food processor told me, he said, Jen, we go through the audit yearly. We can only blow up our building so many times in the audit. So this time we decided to do a cybersecurity attack as our crisis management exercise, which I think is a great approach because it allows you to really vet your entire plan. It gets the food safety people talking with the IT people, talking with the production staff, and of course, leadership has to be involved. Now, if you are BRC certified, they're not quite so subtle about the importance of cyber risk. In fact, under their version 8, your plant is required to implement procedures to document and effectively manage cybersecurity incidents. So it states right in their BRC audit certification materials that you have to have a cybersecurity plan in place. So this is nothing new for the dairy industry. We're proud to be here to support your efforts with a little bit of additional information. And without further ado, I will turn this virtual microphone over to Emily. Thank you again.
Thanks, Jen. So I'm going to share my screen here. Okay. So just real quickly, we'll talk a little bit about some facts and figures. We have some really great claims data that just came out that'll give you a little bit more quantification around this risk. We'll talk about some preventative measures that we're specifically hearing from carriers that they'd like to see and want to see you implement prior to obtaining insurance. And we'll just talk a little bit about cyber insurance so you can be a little bit more familiarized with what it looks like. So first thing that we'll talk about here a little bit has to do with the way that things have evolved. And, you know, Mike did a great job of kicking that off with some of the information that he has. But I think the thing that's really critical for you here to understand is that we went from being really focused on data and really trying to understand the risks and the regulatory requirements around data. And now, due to ransomware and other perils, we're starting to see more of an emphasis on business interruption and lost revenues. So from our perspective, this casts a much broader net in terms of losses. In the past, we really looked at healthcare organizations, financial institutions. They were considered really kind of the higher risk types of categories. But as you'll see from some of our claims data, that's changed a bit in terms of who's really targeted by these attacks. So this is some information from our friends at Net Diligence. Net Diligence is a think tank for the insurance industry that is very specific to cyber risk. They aggregate the information about claims, about exposures, underwriting data, and then provide that to the insurance community to help us really get our arms around this a little bit better. So a couple things to point out here. When we look at the types of incidents that are happening, I think one of the misconceptions we sometimes talk about are that larger companies are the ones that are targeted most frequently. But as you can see here, 99% of these attacks are small to medium-sized businesses, and the average size there is 84 million in revenues. So By definition, net diligence considers small to medium-sized businesses 500 million in revenue and below. So, paring that down to that 84 million and being the average attack puts it into perspective a little bit better. It's not just these really large companies that have tremendous amounts of revenue. It's really companies that are just operating, that maybe are the mom and pop shop down the street that are still in a tough situation when these incidents happen. The graph to the right gives you a little bit better idea of the numbers surrounding how much these incidents cost. And this is, again, the average, so it does kind of scale a little bit, but this is specific to small to medium-sized businesses as well. So the incident itself is going to cost about $145,000. That would be inclusive of any costs that have to do with procuring a digital forensics firm to come in. A lot of times we have very specialized firms that get engaged that are specific to negotiating with the ransom, with the bad guys. Sometimes they are the services that can come in and decrypt things or unlock the codes. There are a lot of different very specialized vendors that get involved in these things, along with having to restore or recreate data. It could be business interruption expenses. So that number is pretty inclusive. On the bottom side of things here, it's really more just kind of the incident response. So another, approximately $200,000 there. So as you can see, the cost of the claim can be pretty costly for companies that maybe don't have insurance. This is, these are all coming from companies that are insured. A lot of times we see that those costs are much higher if they don't have insurance. But more importantly, just gives you a little bit of an idea around how much this costs from how much this can cause disruption from the financial side of things, much less on the business side of things. So a couple more slides that I'll show you here. This gives you an idea of kind of the costs for a ransomware triggered incident. As you can see, the costs for those are a little bit higher. Again, this is factoring in things like business interruption. A lot of times there's restoration of data that needs to be done. There are a lot of different things that need to be cleaned up when you deal with ransomware. The analogy that I frequently use is if you leave the house for the weekend, maybe you go on an anniversary trip and your teenagers decide to throw a party. The cops may come, they may get the teenagers out of your house, but you still have pizza boxes all over the place. Somebody may have thrown a picnic table in the pool, it just kind of depends. So you run into a little bit more cleanup than you might anticipate. A lot of times companies are under the impression that if they pay the ransom, things are done and over with, but that's not typically what we see here. And as you can see, that it really inflates the cost and the requirement to respond to it. This is another number that I think is really important for you to see as well. Now, when it comes to the payments, this is really what we're referring to here. Obviously, there's been a tremendous increase since 2019. A lot of that is because it's successful. When the ransom is demanded, a lot of times it's paid. Again, I think that misconception of if we pay the ransom, everything's okay and we can just kind of move forward as if this never happened drives some of that activity. But some of it is the lack of controls that we'll talk about in the next slides that prevents companies from being able to really get back up and running when an incident happens. So as of Q1, it's around 570,000. I'll say just kind of from our experiences at M3, the demand amounts now are traditionally 7-figure amounts. We see a lot of kind of scary things that happen sometimes when those demands are made. Sometimes they've been in your email, they can see your financials, they've somehow gained access to that. They'll say, hey, we looked at your financials, we know you can afford this. Maybe they've seen that you have an insurance policy, so they puts you in a position of limited power when you're trying to negotiate. So just important to keep in mind that these payments just keep going up because of necessity, because of the sophistication of the malware, but more importantly because preventative measures aren't always taken the way that they should be. Business interruption, I think, is another important point, because I think when you think about your business and the way that you have manufacturing operations, you might not consider yourself a manufacturing company, but ultimately, if your product doesn't get made, and especially when you have pretty sensitive products that you're using as well in terms of spoilage, then you probably are going to run into a situation where you've got some lost revenues. And again, this is on the small side of things, but when we see just a business interruption claim That could be a denial of service attack. That could be a ransomware claim, just something where your operations are shut down. The cost of claims gets pretty heavily inflated. So that gives you a little bit of a better idea. Again, with Net Diligence, they have really great data. So giving us a better idea of the different industry classes that get hit the hardest. And unfortunately, manufacturing, which is inclusive of food processing, is in the top 5 of that list. I would say, as I mentioned before, historically, manufacturing wouldn't have been something that would have concerns our insurance carriers all that much. It became something that a lot of companies purchased because they were concerned about security of their systems. But now it's something where a lot of the insurance comes in because of that massive business interruption type of exposure. And that's not just on your systems. That could be on third-party systems you're working with. If you're using a cloud-based system, for example, it could be because you're doing updates to your system. You could be doing patching, which then shuts things down. For example, for us right now at M3, we're dealing with an internet outage. That could be something that has to do with it as well. So it's really just kind of dependent upon the circumstances, but ultimately when we talk about business interruption, those are the types of things that we're thinking about. So let's talk a little bit about preventative measures. I saw this meme the other day when I was kind of doom scrolling through Instagram, and I just thought it was funny. But I agree, I don't have any passwords left. I am passworded out. I am constantly changing my passwords. I'm constantly trying to think of new passwords. And I think that that's one of the issues that we've seen where we start to talk about better controls being in place. So just to give you a little bit of an idea of some of the controls that insurance carriers are talking to us about, I'll jump through all of these. If you have any questions about any of them or want me to dive into any deeper detail, please feel free to jump in the chat and make mention of that. But I'll try to go into a little bit in kind of the less granular detail on these. So multi-factor authentication is something that we just talked about, but it really has to do with verifying that you are who you say that you are. And it's either because you put in a password and then you get a push alert on your phone. A lot of times when you get into your cell phone, there may be facial recognition or maybe a fingerprint. That's an example of multi-factor authentication or a different form of authentication. Sometimes it'll send a text alert. I know I get those whenever I sign into my Amazon account. So these are all things that we're thinking about with multi-factor authentication. The reason that this is important is because what we're finding is that credential harvesting has become more of a practice for the bad guys. And what credential harvesting is when they're able to go and find your password, get your email address and your password, and then gain access to a computer system. If they do that and they have your password, they may have the keys to the castle. When it comes to things like ransomware, sometimes we're seeing open ports, which we'll talk about in a second. If those are properly secured so that there's only certain people who can access those open ports, then multi-factor authentication can come in and assist with helping prevent those from gaining improper access. So it feels like something that it maybe will take away from the productivity of your employees. It might feel like an extra step that's unnecessary, but I'll leave you with a statistic that I got from Travelers, which is that 50% of their claims activity was due to the fact that multi-factor authentication was not in place. And that's a pretty staggering number when you think about the amount of claims activity that we're seeing, which has obviously increased significantly in frequency. So anything you can do to prevent the claim from happening, I promise will be a relief in that moment. Open ports are, very simply put, the ports are the way that your computer communicates, your hardware communicates with different sources. So for example, there's a certain port that exists just for transferring of your email information. There's a port that exists for transfer of information when it comes to the internet. Sometimes SCADA systems have ports that are very specific because they need to communicate with one device or another within your manufacturing processes. So the idea is that when you keep these open, obviously the flow of information works really well. Think of it as a tunnel. But the idea is that if you don't have the proper security around these and you just leave them open, anybody can get in. And again, that's where we see some of these more brute force ransomware attacks that happen. It's because there wasn't the proper authentication around them. Maybe you're not even using them anymore and they're just sitting idle. So a lot of times what we're seeing from insurance carriers is that they're scanning your systems from an external perspective to see what open ports you have, and then encouraging you to close those open ports. Endpoint detection is similar to antivirus. I know that's something that we talked a lot about 10 years ago. This goes a little bit further. So, antivirus software is really just kind of taking a look at viruses and whatever else. Endpoint detection takes it a step further to look at suspicious activity and then alerts people within the organization that there's suspicious activity happening. A lot of times what we see is that IT is doing a great job, but they can only do so much. If they have more than, as you can imagine, 20, 30, 50 devices, it's really hard for them to keep a constant monitoring manually. So this sort of automates it for them. Incident response planning, this is something that Jen talked about a little bit before we started here, but it's not any different than your disaster recovery. You're asking a lot of the same questions. Who needs to be informed? Who do we call? Do we have insurance for this? How do we manage the process? Does law enforcement need to be notified? All of the things that you need to kind of hammer out ahead of time based on the different incidents. And sometimes your incident response planning is as simple as just saying, we need to call M3 first because we have an insurance policy. We go with certain vendors that we know are on the insurance carrier's panel, in just kind of keeping something that's a little bit more fluid, but keeps the most important parts of the communication chain within everybody's hands at the time of an incident. One of the trickiest parts is that we often find that when computer systems are shut down, we feel kind of useless. If we don't have access to our email, we feel like we don't have access to anything. And that's kind of the issue that we run into with getting things rolling and getting things moving in an expedited way. So that's where incident response planning comes in. Backups are really important, obviously, and the redundancies in backups is even more critical. So a lot of times what we're seeing now is that there may be physical backups that are on site that are updating your information, that are maybe a contingency if there is a shutdown of your manufacturing systems. But a lot of companies now are taking a look at something that would be in the cloud, where you can just kind of update things in real time and you're not necessarily having to do these manual updates on a frequent basis. The other part to think about too is geographical boundaries. If you have a server system that is set up, maybe in a tornado ravaged place, do you have a backup that's somewhere that wouldn't be? That's something that we talk about sometimes too. So sometimes it's just physical redundancy of those backups. Patching is critically important. As we've seen lately, there are a lot of what we call zero-day attacks, where these incidents are happening before anybody really realizes that there's any sort of vulnerability. When those vulnerabilities are found, the patches are released to try to fix those. We saw that in the Microsoft Exchange servers. We've seen that in SolarWinds. We've seen that in some of the headline kind of inducing incidents that have happened. So, making sure that you're patching things as quickly as you possibly can. Critical patches are happening almost immediately. That's really looked upon as something that's critical. The last three have to do with social engineering. And again, that's something that we still see. We're still running into these types of claims, even though we're talking so much about ransomware. And what social engineering looks like is that it's typically someone initiates a transfer, a wire transfer. Sometimes it can look like someone that you've already done business with. It could be that a bad guy is actually in their email and corresponding with you, saying, we've changed our instructions, don't pay the invoice here, pay it here instead. So the request with that is, always call back when those changes are made. And I think it's really important that you initiate that phone call. What we find sometimes is that the bad guys will initiate the transfer. They'll get someone on the phone and they'll call you to make it feel like it's really legitimate. That's not obviously a legitimate thing to do. We want to make sure that you are, initiating that phone call, maybe calling more than one person to make sure that those changes have been made. Make sure that the transfers are only done by certain people with certain roles within the company. Don't allow anybody to make a transfer within the company. That's a lot of times where mistakes are made. And the last part is, who's having oversight over those controls? If, for example, if you have someone in accounts payable, do they have to talk to a manager? Do they have to talk to your controller or someone in the finance department in order to make that final transfer? So is there just someone else who's kind of checking their work? So I know that's a lot of information. I would say that when we talk about sort of baseline controls that are needed to get an insurance policy, the top three are the ones that we hear about the most. Multi-factor authentication makes it very, very difficult for us to get you an insurance policy. Right now, that is considered kind of the stage one most critical thing that you can do. The good news is that it's very easy to implement. And the hard news is that you've got the human factor that you have to kind of gamble with. So there are a lot of employees that may feel like this extra step is causing some issues with them, but typically it's something that you can kind of move through relatively quickly. Unfortunately, the implementation of it is not usually cost prohibitive. I will say that for all of the complaining that happens, it is one of the, like I said, one of the singular most important controls that we can implement. So just kind of moving on to the cyber insurance side of things, I wanted to give you an idea of what happens once you have an incident. I think a lot of times we talk about all of these headlines, we talk about the devastation that's been ravaged, but we don't necessarily understand what was kind of happening in that control room. So first, there's the discovery of the incident, and I gave you a few different triggers here, ransomware, again, being the most common that we see. But DDoS attacks or directed denial of service attacks are when there's so much traffic on your website that it shuts things down. A lot of times this is used for anybody who has retail operations, and that can be used to request a ransom. It could be that your data is encrypted. It could be that your systems are shut down. Most recently, what we're seeing is theft of confidential information. And that then has a ransom tied to it. So there's lots of different ways that the criminals will target you. At that point then, this is where the insurance comes in and gets involved. And so we immediately engage with an attorney who we call a breach coach. It's a privacy attorney who's completely dedicated into the privacy law and cybersecurity space. So they work with you to then engage with cybersecurity vendors that I mentioned before. That could be a digital forensics vendor. That could be someone who really specializes in ransomware. That could be working to obtain additional IT help for you if you need that. If there's any data that's been compromised that falls within the 50 state statutes, which is based on the residents' information. So if it's someone who resides in California or New York or in a different state, that's the statute that you have to follow for the means of notification. Legal will help you with that, but that would also be covered kind of as the initial response. The short-term side of things, you may see class action lawsuits. Those aren't very common, but if there's consumer data involved, that's something that we are starting to see more of. Regulatory investigations where you can sit down and have a chat with someone either in the Attorney General office or somewhere else to figure out what happened and to determine if any fines or penalties are levied. Hardware replacement is something that we often see because servers can be shut down. That's something that is done on a replacement cost basis. So they'll indemnify you for the software, or for the hardware that you previously had. Software may be part of that as well if you need to repurchase licenses or anything. And then the business interruption, which I mentioned before. At the very end of things, we sometimes see companies that are dealing with this anywhere from 3 to 6 months after the incident happened, because there is so much cleanup and there's so much remediation that happens. One of I think the great things that the insurance policy has started to cover has to do with reputational harm. So if over the course of 6 months, it's usually 180 days, if you see a drop in some of your revenues and it's directly tied to a media report, an adverse media report about your incident, then there is coverage under the policy to indemnify you for that. So this gives you an idea of kind of how things function and how the process looks. When it comes to the cyber coverage, this gives you a little bit of a visual of what it looks like, but ultimately it's a little bit of a unique insurance solution that it provides the defense and indemnity in the event that there is any sort of issue with a regulatory situation, if you've failed to keep things private or secure that you were supposed to contractually. If there's any sort of litigation that happens, then there's coverage under the policy in that very traditional way that you would think there would be. What's unique about this is that it also will provide coverage for any of the expenses that you have in excess of your retention for the response to any of this. Things that are covered are the things that I mentioned before with the incident response costs, which include the legal, the forensics, credit monitoring and remediation. But again, if there's a need to pay a ransom, and that's something that you, the attorney, and the forensics teams have determined is your best course of action, you can be indemnified for that. There will be a team that will help you engage in obtaining Bitcoin or whatever cryptocurrency may be demanded. There's lots of different resources and tools that are all included in that policy, and it's kind of serves as a built-in incident response plan for you. Again, when we talk about the business interruption expenses, those are pretty broad in the sense that it includes any of the coverage that you need in the event that you have lost revenues because the systems were shut down, either through a ransomware event, someone gets into your systems and is just managed to shut them down just as a nefarious actor. If there's some sort of glitch, just is dependent a little bit on the policy wording. But ideally, it's really meant to make sure that if your computer systems prevent you from making money, there's an opportunity for you to be reimbursed for those lost revenues.
And Emily, I'm just going to let you know we have about a minute left before we'll move into Q&A.
Okay.
Sorry for the interruption, and I know that you're coming to the conclusion of yours as well.
No worries. So I can just be really quick here. The other thing I wanted to mention had to do with the state of the marketplace, and obviously it's a tough time right now. I think the big thing to take away from this is that pricing is going up as a result of the claims activity that we've talked about, and also due to the fact that they're a little bit more prescriptive when it comes to controls. So the things that I mentioned before, I think are really critical for you to think about when you're in the process of procuring your cyber insurance, and certainly to think about when you're just in the process of upping your cyber controls and trying to make things a little bit better. So I can actually stop there. I think that covers everything that I wanted to cover today, but happy to answer any questions that come up.
Thank you so much. What a wonderful presentation, Emily. And we're glad to be moving into Q&A now. We're going to start with some of the questions that were pre-submitted. First, we keep sensitive information regarding our employees in online files. What are our obligations for the security of this data?
Yeah, so you really have a fiduciary duty to keep that information secure and to keep that information private. Ultimately, attorneys general are going to be the ones who have the most oversight into your controls and what you need to do to keep that information secure. Right now, the statutes aren't as prescriptive when it comes to certain controls that you need to have in place, mostly because it would be a little bit of a difficult process to keep updating that as the controls change. But you should think of it the same way that you would think about consumer data, in the sense that your duties to notify, your duties to provide credit monitoring and remediation are the same as they would be if that was a customer's data or if it was another business's data.
Great information. Our next question sort of speaks to something that Jen got to early on in her presentation. We have SOPs, standard operating procedures for food safety. Does something like this exist for secure online sales? Looking for a blueprint or a checklist here.
Yeah, so I will have to look and see if I can find a resource for you, but it's probably pretty easy to Google. The payment card industry has a set of data security standards. So we call it the PCI DSS standards. It's something that will give you an idea of what kind of security protocols you have to have in place when you're taking a certain number of credit card transactions. The really critical thing for you to know here is not necessarily to implement those yourself unless you're actually taking and storing credit card data. But when you're working with a vendor who does that, because most companies now work with vendors, third-party vendors, to make sure that they're PCI DSS compliant, because you have vicarious liability in that in the event that they do have an incident and they weren't compliant.
And PCI DSS is exactly what I was going to mention too, so that is perfect. The Open Web Application Security Project, OWASP, is another tool you can use. It walks you through how to test if your site is secure, obviously keeping PCI DSS the more rigid standard and the one that needs to be complied with if you want to continue to handle payment card data. That is the one to keep an eye on. But if you're just looking for how do we make sure we're doing things correctly, how do we ask the right questions to a vendor, OWASP has some really great guidance out there available as well.
Terrific. One more question that was pre-submitted, then we have a couple from the chat. For the staff we have in charge of our email accounts and website, do you recommend any cybersecurity trainings?
Yeah, I can jump in on that. I think one of the things that we highly recommend is any sort of phishing trainings. A lot of times there are dummy phishing emails that are sent out that if you click on it, you have to do some additional trainings. I know we at M3 do a number of proactive trainings, so it's about once a month that we get a video that's actually pretty funny. We enjoy them quite a bit. That talks about different ways that you could potentially be targeted as an employee to share data or to shut things down. So I see the question about the vendors. KnowBe4 is a really good vendor that we hear about pretty frequently. We use Mimecast is one that also has those types of services. So those would be the two that I would recommend.
And the fact that you're asking the question about training is fantastic, because everyone has different training needs. And so part of that would be, where is your staff skill sets? Where do they think they need, some additional help? There's a ton of reputable vendors out there that are good. SANS is one that comes to mind. They have a variety of free offerings and then really ridiculously expensive paid offerings. If you can afford their paid offerings, by all means, they're fantastic. But even like Black Hills Information Security, Black Hills InfoSec is an example. Small vendor, does a lot of free content, makes it available. So it's that continued engagement for folks involved in cybersecurity, because the landscape does change quickly. The fact that you're asking, is there training out there that they should have? That's a great question. And I encourage you to, approach your staff. What are they looking for? What are their needs?
All right, we're going to send some links to some of the information referenced in the Q&A here as a follow-up to this, and also include that in our member newsletter as we share a recording of this. Final quick questions. We're going to do it rapid fire, get it done here quickly. My business is very small, just 25 employees. What's the most likely attack on my business? Mike, what do you think?
Fraud. It's going to be some kind of fraud. And so again, the controls that Emily mentioned are fantastic. Make sure you double check any change to a payment, have organizational controls. Only certain people can change payments. That's going to be the most common one I would expect for a small business, is that kind of fraud.
And final question goes to Emily. How secure are cloud services like Dropbox?
I feel like it's a little bit more complicated than a kind of a yes or no response, but I think that generally speaking, we're becoming more reliant on the cloud for a reason. Typically when you have those larger companies like AWS and Microsoft managing the process for securing your data, you're in a better spot than trying to manage that security for yourself. So it's not perfect. Again, you need to think about things like multi-factor authentication to secure your login. You want to make sure that that data is protected as it possibly can be. But when it comes to someone, a nefarious actor getting in and pulling that data, they've got better controls than you could probably procure on your own.
Well, thank you so very much to all of our presenters today for sharing their expertise and really actionable, practical kinds of steps that we can all take to make our businesses a little bit safer online. I'll make sure to share contact information for all of our presenters today in that follow-up email. And I know that they're very happy to work with you as you move forward on taking some action to make your business more cyber secure. I want to close by inviting everyone to join us on November 16th for our next installment of WCMA members only webinars. We'll be talking about how to create an impactful internship program as everyone faces a labor shortage. So we invite you to join us again next month and share any ideas that you might have for future webinar offerings at any time. Thanks so much for joining us today.